Mr. Hayes, you are here to interview for the Head of Global Strategy post?
Yes, ma'am.
Have a seat. Suppose I am your boss, and I am making a wrong decision that could sink the company. What would you do? Follow my orders or rebel against me?
I wouldn't rebel, ma'am. I would simply put the data in front of you. Because a boss can be wrong, ego can be wrong, but numbers never lie. A real leader is one who trusts the company's profit more than their own pride.
And if a small new company starts competing with us in the market, how would you destroy them?
I wouldn't waste my time and money trying to destroy them. I would just make my own work so much better that the small company surrenders on its own. You don't win business by pulling others down. You win by making your own line bigger.
Right. Suppose the company suddenly faces a massive loss, and you need to save money immediately. What would you do? Fire employees or drop the product quality?
I would do neither. I would stop the useless expenses of the top executives, the ones they do just for show-off and luxury.
Your answers were good, Hayes, but you are rejected for this job.
May I know the reason for the rejection, ma'am?
The reason? The reason is your class. At Thorne Enterprises, we don't just hire talent, we hire a status. And your background, your middle-class manners, they don't match our company's culture at all.
You are not rejecting me because of my abilities, ma'am. You are rejecting me because my abilities terrify you. Keep this job to yourself. But remember one thing. Those who have palaces made of glass shouldn't throw stones at someone else's status. Because when these glass palaces shatter, the deepest wounds are felt by those sitting inside.
Amidst the towering, magnificent skyscrapers of New York City, the headquarters of Thorne Enterprises stood proudly like an impenetrable, ruthless fortress. Its owner, Richard Thorne, was counted among the city's most feared, powerful, and relentless billionaires, a man whose mere gesture could send tremors through the stock market. Since this morning, a terrifying, deadly silence had gripped the massive office. Richard sat in his chair like a predator, while right in front of him, a highly senior executive from his company stood with his head bowed like a condemned criminal, trembling and drenched in sweat. "Do you call this a minor mistake?" Richard demanded, slamming a thick file violently onto the glass table. "Because of this minor mistake of yours, my company lost $2 million this morning. Richard Thorne doesn't pay for apologies, he pays for perfection. If you think you can compensate for your sheer incompetence with my wealth, then you are the biggest fool in this city." The helpless, desperate employee begged for his job, pleading for the sake of his family, his children, and his 20 years of service. But a demonic, callous, and cruel smirk spread across Richard's face. He pressed the intercom button and ordered security to physically drag the man out of the building. Right at that moment, Fallon stormed into the office. Fallon was Richard Thorne's only daughter, an impossibly arrogant heiress. She took off her expensive sunglasses and, completely ignoring the weeping employee standing there, carelessly tossed her limited edition Prada bag onto the sofa. A fierce anger burned in Fallon's eyes, and her face wore that distinct elite arrogance that made her look at others like they were insects. "What kind of joke is this, Dad?" Fallon snapped in a sharp, furious, and commanding voice. "My new custom-made Bugatti was supposed to be delivered this morning. I've been waiting for hours with my friends, only to find out it's still stuck in transit. You always do this. Nothing in this city ever happens on time for me." Seeing his daughter's fury, all of Richard's ruthlessness vanished for a split second. He immediately picked up his desk phone and dialed the owner of the luxury car dealership directly. The moment the call connected, Richard delivered a threat so horrifying it made the man on the other end break into a cold sweat. "Have you lost your mind? Why hasn't my daughter's car been delivered yet?" Richard roared. How dare you dealership people make Richard Thorne's daughter wait? If that car isn't parked in my daughter's garage before sunset today, I will buy your entire dealership tomorrow morning and hire you as a security guard outside your own showroom. Slamming the phone down, Richard pulled an exclusive, no-limit black credit card from his jacket pocket and held it out to Fallon. "Keep this, Fallon," Richard said, his voice laced with a strange mix of blind affection and immense pride. "As long as your father is alive, you never need to wait for anything or look at a price tag. If that car is late, go out today and buy yourself any other car. Buy any diamond set you want. Never leave your desires unfulfilled. The words compromise and wait do not exist in the Thorne family dictionary." A deeply arrogant, sinister smirk appeared on Fallon's face as she tucked the card into her designer jacket. Just then, Richard glanced at his gold Rolex and suddenly remembered something. "Fallon, I have to leave right now for an incredibly urgent, multi-million-dollar acquisition meeting. We have the final interviews for the senior strategy head position today. I want you to conduct those interviews in my place. I need someone whose caliber matches the prestige of this company. Someone who thinks as ruthlessly as we do. Handle it." Fallon nodded with a haughty smile. Deciding the fate of others, looking down on them, and humiliating them was her absolute favorite hobby. Far away from this world of blinding glitz and arrogance, in a modest but meticulously kept middle-class apartment in New York, Hayes stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his one and only good tie. Hayes wasn't a desperately poor boy. Rather, he came from a deeply proud middle-class family where money mattered, but no one wore it as an ego trip. His mother, Helena, was an incredibly calm, wise woman who gave her son the courage to take on the world. Helena placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder, looked into her son's eyes through the mirror, and smiled a deep, comforting smile. "Today is your day, Hayes. It doesn't matter what the world thinks about your clothes or your status. Your ability and your hard work are your greatest identity." With utmost respect, Hayes kissed his mother's hands and stepped out of the house with unwavering determination. He was looking for a job, but he didn't want it handed to him like charity. He wanted to earn it purely on the strength of his hard work, his degrees, and his razor-sharp mind. A few hours later, Hayes was inside that towering skyscraper of Thorne Enterprises. He was waiting for his turn in the lavish executive lounge on the 45th floor. All the other candidates sitting there belonged to the city's wealthiest, most elite families and top-tier universities. They were all wearing designer Italian suits worth thousands of dollars, expensive watches, and branded leather shoes. When their eyes landed on Hayes, his ordinary, unbranded yet clean suit looked incredibly strange and inferior to them. Hayes's attire and his simple demeanor stood out starkly in that luxurious environment. One rich kid nudged the guy sitting next to him and deliberately said in a slightly loud voice, "Looks like someone accidentally sent the coffee delivery guy up to the executive lounge. I guess HR is just dragging people off the street for interviews these days." The other guy laughed, glaring at Hayes, and replied, "The poor guy probably just got lost. He probably doesn't even know that the price of one employee's shoe at Thorne Enterprises is more than his entire year's rent." Hayes heard every single word crystal clear. He absolutely despised their crude mockery and their shallow mentality, but he didn't give them any unnecessary reaction, nor did he let himself feel sad or allow his confidence to break. Hayes just sat there peacefully waiting for his turn, and right at that moment, Fallon stepped into the interview room carrying that same massive ego, that same arrogance, and the sharp clicking sound of her designer heels. A few minutes later, a secretary called out Hayes's name. Filled with absolute confidence, Hayes walked into the massive, luxurious interview room. Right in the center of the room, across a massive glass table, sat Fallon. Her dominant presence, her expensive designer watch, and the sheer arrogance plastered across her face were living proof that she held the fate of every person who walked into that room. Fallon brushed her fingers against Hayes's modest resume and, without even bothering to read it in full, carelessly pushed it aside on the table. She looked Hayes up and down and began the interview with a deeply condescending smirk. She started straight out the gate with incredibly sharp, deliberately confusing questions designed to break him. "Mr. Hayes," Fallon said, leaning back in her chair, "let's assume our company is in the middle of a massive merger and the market suddenly crashes. Our shares are plummeting and the board of directors is in a full-blown panic. What do you do?" Fallon was absolutely certain that a guy from a middle-class background wouldn't have a practical answer to a multi-million-dollar crisis of this magnitude. But Hayes didn't flinch at all. Looking straight into Fallon's eyes, he began to answer in a very calm, composed voice. "I wouldn't panic, Miss Thorne, because a market crash is never the end. It's an opportunity. When shares drop, it's not the time to be afraid, but rather the perfect time to aggressively buy back our own shares. Not only will this solidify our control over the company, but it will also send a clear message to the market that we have absolute faith in our financials. As for the board of directors, a leader's job isn't to soothe them. It's to show them that this crisis is handing us the perfect opportunity to buy out our competitors at a massive discount. Business isn't driven by fear, but by striking the right blow at the exact right time." Hayes's answer was so precise, so sharp, and so incredibly practical that it shook Fallon to her core. She immediately fired off several more complex questions back to back about hostile takeovers, risk management, and international markets. But Hayes answered every single question with such brilliance, top-tier strategy, and flawless logic that he completely silenced Fallon in that massive room. Hayes's words weren't just regurgitated textbook knowledge. They radiated the formidable capability of a true leader and the raw aggression of a hungry lion. Fallon tried to maintain a calm exterior, but deep down, her monstrous ego was severely wounded. She simply couldn't stomach the fact that an ordinary-looking guy, whose suit didn't even have a major brand tag, could be smarter and far more strategic than her. Every answer Hayes gave triggered a deep, gnawing insecurity within Fallon. She realized that if this guy were given a job at Thorne Enterprises, he would climb the corporate ladder at lightning speed purely on his own merit. This wasn't a man who would survive as a yes-man or a corporate slave. He was a man who could easily become a genuine threat to the company itself tomorrow. Fallon's arrogance simply wouldn't allow her to give someone smarter than her the chance to stand as her equal. With a sharp, aggressive jerk, she snapped Hayes's file shut and tossed it back onto the table. "You haven't been selected for this job, Hayes," Fallon said in a cold, apathetic tone. Hayes was slightly taken aback because he knew his interview had been absolutely flawless. He asked with utmost respect, "May I know where I fell short, Miss Thorne?" Flashing a highly toxic, degrading smile, Fallon replied, "Your shortcoming isn't in your degrees, it's in your class. At Thorne Enterprises, we don't just hire people, we maintain a status. Your mindset and your social standing simply do not align with our corporate culture. I don't care how smart you are, but to be a part of this company, you need to seriously work on your status and your etiquette. You are just not suitable for us." Hayes instantly understood that this had absolutely nothing to do with his capabilities or his intellect. It was entirely about Fallon's fragile, hollow ego that simply couldn't tolerate the brilliance of a middle-class guy. It deeply frustrated Hayes to see that in this world, the wealthy were perfectly willing to strangle raw talent just to feed their own egos, and that their shallowness knew no bounds. But Hayes didn't walk out of there with his head bowed. Nor did he beg. He stood up from his chair, buttoned his coat with absolute dignity, looked straight into Fallon's eyes, and delivered a crushing statement that hit her arrogance like a violent slap. "You aren't rejecting me because I lack ability, Miss Thorne. You are rejecting me because my ability terrifies you," Hayes said in a chillingly heavy voice. "You can keep your job, but always remember one thing. Inherited empires are often incredibly fragile, and people like me who have absolutely nothing to lose learn how to shatter glass empires like yours very quickly." With that, Hayes turned around and walked out of the interview room with immense pride and unshakable confidence, leaving Fallon seething in her own ego, glaring at him in pure fury. Stepping out of that magnificent Thorne Enterprises building, Hayes felt all of his confidence shatter for a brief moment. When he got back to his small apartment, he was utterly exhausted and deeply devastated. It felt as though, no matter how hard you work in this world, no matter how much knowledge you acquire, these rich elites would never let you move forward simply on the power of their wealth and influence. He slumped heavily onto the sofa and poured everything out to his mother, Helena. He explained how his flawless interview meant absolutely nothing, all because of pure ego and the arrogance of old money. Helena listened to her son's entire story with immense peace and patience. She saw the heavy disappointment clouding Hayes's face, walked over to him, and placed her hand on his shoulder. She took Hayes's face in her hands and said something that instantly turned the dying embers inside him into a raging inferno. "You have no reason to be sad, Hayes. They didn't reject you because you weren't good enough for them. They rejected you because they realized you were far too big for the chair they had to offer. If they refuse to give you a seat at their table, don't beg them for it. Build your own table. Do not let the anger and the fire from the insult you endured today die inside your chest. Turn this fire into your ultimate power. Work day and night, and make yourself so massive that one day their entire empire looks incredibly small next to your stature. You don't have to work for them, Hayes. You have to break their arrogance." His mother's powerful, blazing words breathed a completely new life into Hayes. Every trace of despair and hopelessness vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by an incredibly fierce, calm, and invincible obsession. In that very second, he made a silent vow to himself that he would never work in anyone else's empire again. Instead, he would build an empire of his own, one that would shake Thorne Enterprises down to its very foundations. From that night onward, Hayes completely erased the line between day and night. He launched his own investment and strategy firm out of a small garage. He didn't have the multi-million-dollar funding of Thorne Enterprises, but he had a razor-sharp mind that could anticipate every single move the market was going to make. Hayes worked relentlessly. He barely slept properly for weeks. He played market gambles that even the biggest billionaires wouldn't dare touch. His integrity, his raw aggression, and his flawless strategic decisions sent shockwaves through the financial world. In just a few short years, Hayes's modest firm, operating under the name Apex Global, skyrocketed to become one of the most powerful and Titan-level corporations in the world. Today, Hayes had become the kind of name whose single gesture dictated the rise and fall of the market. He truly had built his own massive table, a table where the biggest elites in the city now waited weeks just to get a seat. Meanwhile, on the other side, the wheel of time was turning rapidly and ruthlessly. Empires built solely on the foundation of arrogance and ego never take long to crumble. Driven by Fallon's sheer ignorance, her boundless ego, and her habit of hiring only sycophants, Thorne Enterprises began rotting from the inside out. Blinded by her own pride, Fallon made horrific, amateurish business decisions that completely broke the company's back. And then, exactly what Hayes had predicted during his interview finally happened. The market crashed. Only this time, Thorne Enterprises had zero strategy to handle the crisis. The company's shares plummeted to dirt, investors scrambled to pull their money out, and the corporation was buried under billions of dollars of crushing debt. Richard Thorne, a man whose very name used to make the entire city tremble, couldn't stop his empire from collapsing like a house of cards, even after throwing all his remaining power and wealth at the problem. The situation spiraled to the point where the banks officially declared Thorne Enterprises bankrupt and issued the final order to auction off the massive corporation. Richard and Fallon knocked on every single door and begged every billionaire they knew to save their company, but absolutely no one was willing to buy a sinking ship. On the final day of the auction, An anonymous but immensely powerful investment firm cleared all of Thorne Enterprises' debt and completely executed a hostile takeover. Today, in that same magnificent 45th floor corner office, Richard Thorne and Fallon sat in absolute silence, completely broken. This was the exact same office where Richard once destroyed people's lives and where Fallon had humiliated Hayes just to feed her ego. Today, the two of them were waiting for their new, anonymous boss, the person before whom they had to sign their official surrender papers. All of Fallon's arrogance, all of her glamour, was completely gone. Her face was smeared only with the dark soot of a terrifying defeat. Suddenly, the heavy doors of that luxurious cabin swung open with a resounding thud. Richard and Fallon snapped their heads toward the door at the exact same time, and in the next second, the breath caught in their throats. Hayes stood in the doorway. Fallon's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. Her entire body began to tremble. She couldn't believe her eyes. The middle-class boy she had spitefully thrown out because of her ego was now standing right in front of them as the sole owner of their entire empire. With incredibly calm, measured steps, Hayes walked over and stood at the head of the massive glass table, the very spot where Richard used to sit. He picked up the takeover documents resting on the table, pulled out his gold pen, and with absolute grace, signed his name on them. Hayes looked directly into Fallon's trembling eyes and spoke in a deep, chilling voice that pierced straight through to her soul. "Good morning, Miss Fallon. I'm quite certain you remember me very well. A few years ago in this exact building, you told me that my mindset and my social standing didn't match your company's culture. You told me I had no class. I told you that very same day that inherited empires are incredibly fragile, Miss Fallon. You didn't reject me because I lacked talent. You rejected me because my capabilities terrified you. Look at you today. Your hollow ego and your arrogance have brought your father's entire glass castle crashing down to the ground. Today, this entire company, this entire building, and even the chair you are sitting on, it all belongs to the boy you thought was entirely beneath you." Richard Thorne, who had been sitting in dead silence, finally grasped the full horrifying magnitude of his daughter's stupidity and the ego that had dragged them both out onto the streets today. Overwhelmed by shame and the crushing realization of ultimate defeat, Richard bowed his head forever. Tears of intense regret and absolute failure streamed down Fallon's face. She knew that today, she hadn't just lost her company. She had lost her entire identity and her precious ego forever. No one should ever judge another person's worth, because when the wheel of time turns, it reduces even the greatest of kings to paupers, Hayes said, adjusting his coat and delivering his final words. With that, Hayes turned on his heel and walked out of the cabin with that same immense pride and fierce confidence. All that was left behind was a ruined father, his arrogant daughter sobbing uncontrollably, and the ashes of their ego, upon which Hayes's new invincible empire now proudly stood.